Picture yourself as a successful young professional in the lucky country. You've done everything right. University degree, six-figure salary, hard work. You live in a nation with more land per person than almost anywhere else on Earth. But take a look around. Something is wrong. You aren't building wealth. You're drowning. You aren't priced out of a home because you're poor. You're priced out because a derelict shack in Sydney now makes more money in capital gains than you do working a full-time job. Welcome to the Australian miracle. It was sold to the world as 30 years of recession-free growth, a superpower of lifestyle and opportunity. But if you look under the hood, that miracle cost $10 trillion in household debt. And what did we actually buy with all that borrowed cash? We didn't build a tech sector or a manufacturing base. We built a houses and holes economy that now ranks 93rd in complexity, right between Uganda and Pakistan. And here is the sickest joke of all. In a country famous for its vast empty spaces, we have engineered a shortage of dirt, forcing families with jobs to sleep in their cars. Today, we are going to tear apart the most successful Ponzi scheme in history. We're going to expose how a government addicted to immigration and a banking sector addicted to debt turned a nation of owners into a nation of serfs. It starts with a single signature in 1999 that rigged the game forever. But before we talk about the housing bubble, we have to understand why we became obsessed with property in the first place. It's because we stopped doing anything else. To understand the rot at the core of the economy, we need to look at a metric called economic complexity. Put simply, this measures how smart your economy is. It asks a basic question. Can your nation take raw materials and turn them into something complex like a microchip, a jet engine, or a medical device? Or do you just dig things out of the ground and put them on a boat? Let's look at the scoreboard. On one side, you have countries like South Korea and Switzerland. They are resource poor but innovation rich. They take simple inputs and use human capital to create high-value exports, electronics, pharmaceuticals, precision machinery. They create wealth through brain power. Then there is Australia. Despite our high wages, we currently rank 93rd on the Harvard Economic Complexity Index. We are lower than Vietnam, lower than Mexico, and sandwiched right between Uganda and Pakistan. Let that sink in. Stop for a second. Does that sound like the lucky country to you? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I genuinely want to see if your reality matches the official data. We are the dumbest rich country on Earth. We effectively operate like a colonial outpost from the 19th century. We export iron ore, coal, and gas, essentially red dirt, black dirt, and invisible dirt. In exchange, we import literally everything else: our cars, our phones, our medicine, and even our refined fuel. We don't make things anymore. We just sell off the furniture. The verdict? Australia isn't really a modern industrial economy. It is a massive, diversified mining company that happens to have its own currency and a defense force. And this emptiness is the root of the problem. When a country stops investing in business, innovation, and manufacturing, that capital has to go somewhere. And in Australia, because we don't make anything, we decided to invest in the only thing we had left: each other's houses. This is where the government stepped in to pour gasoline on the fire. To find the patient zero of this financial virus, we have to travel back to September 1999. At the time, housing was boring. It was for living in, not for getting rich. But then, the government introduced a policy change that would turn the entire property market into a tax-subsidized casino. The 50% capital gains tax discount. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. Here is the simple toxic math of how it works. In most countries, if you lose money on an investment, you lose money. In Australia, thanks to a quirk called negative gearing, if you lose money on a rental property, the government lets you deduct that loss from your working wage. Basically, the taxman pays you to fail. But before 1999, this was just a tax write-off. The new law supercharged it. It meant that when you eventually sold that house for a massive profit, you only had to pay tax on half the gain. Suddenly, the strategy was obvious. You didn't buy a house to rent it out for a profit. You bought a house to lose money on purpose, slash your income tax bill to zero, and then cash out tax-free years later. The effect? It effectively declared war on first home buyers. Imagine a young couple at an auction. They are bidding with their own after-tax savings. Standing next to them is an investor. The investor can bid higher because the government is effectively paying for part of his mortgage through tax refunds. The couple is playing Monopoly. The investor is playing with cheat codes. Almost overnight, the psychology of the nation changed. Australians realized that working hard for a salary was a mug's game. The real money wasn't in innovation or starting a business or getting a promotion. The real money was in leveraging yourself to the eyeballs and buying dirt. We stopped being a nation of workers and became a nation of speculators. Earning a salary is for suckers. Buying land is for winners. But for this scheme to work, you needed one more thing. You needed unlimited credit. And that is where the banks lost their minds. If the tax system provided the spark for this fire, the Australian banking sector poured the gasoline. To understand why your country feels less like a dynamic economy and more like a retirement village with a stock market, you have to look at the big four banks: Commonwealth, Westpac, NAB, and ANZ. In most healthy economies, the primary role of a bank is to allocate capital to productive businesses. Their job is to find the next Elon Musk, the next Henry Ford, or even just the next local bakery owner, and give them the fuel to grow. This creates jobs, it creates innovation, and it creates real value. But in Australia, the banks stopped doing their job a long time ago. Instead of fueling the engine of capitalism, they became a parasite attached to it. They mutated into what economists call the banking blob, a massive, risk-averse oligopoly that effectively swallowed the free market. Let's look at the data because the numbers are terrifying. Back in the 1990s, business lending and housing lending were roughly equal. The banks balanced their portfolios, but today that balance has been destroyed. Currently, over 60% to 70% of all Australian bank lending is funneled directly into residential mortgages. In comparison, lending to actual businesses, the people who hire staff and build things, has collapsed to historical lows. We don't have a banking system anymore. We have a mortgage hedge fund with a government guarantee. Why did this happen? It wasn't an accident. It was a choice born out of lazy banking. If this shift in our banking system surprises you, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this warning to more people who think their savings are safe. You see, lending to a small business is hard work. You have to read business plans, assess market risks, and trust an entrepreneur's vision. If the business fails, the money is gone. But lending to a house? That's easy. It's lazy. You have a physical asset you can seize. And because of international banking rules, specifically the Basel regulations, Australian banks are allowed to hold less capital in reserve against a mortgage than against a business loan. The regulatory system literally incentivizes them to ignore businesses and pump up the property bubble. Let's visualize what this looks like on the ground. Imagine two people walk into a branch of the Commonwealth Bank today. Person A is an entrepreneur. She wants to start a precision manufacturing company in Western Sydney. She has a solid business plan. She wants to hire 20 locals, and she wants to export high-tech components to Asia. She is exactly what the Australian economy needs to survive the 21st century. Person B is a property speculator. He wants to buy his fifth investment property, a rundown terrace house that he plans to leave empty or rent out at an exorbitant rate. He produces nothing. He hires no one. He adds zero value to the nation. Guess who gets the money? The entrepreneur is grilled. She is asked for personal guarantees. She is told the risk is too high. She likely walks out empty-handed. The speculator? He has rolled out the red carpet. The bank manager looks at his existing equity, stamps the approval, and hands him $1 million. This is the mechanism of our decline. We are starving the makers to feed the takers. The consequence of this capital misallocation is a concept that sounds boring, but is actually deadly. Productivity stagnation. Productivity is the only thing that raises living standards in the long run. It means doing more with less. It comes from new technology, better machinery, and smarter business models. But you can't have productivity growth if all your national capital is trapped in bricks and mortar. A house does not become more productive over time. A house built in 1970 is still just a pile of bricks in 2025. It doesn't invent anything. It doesn't export anything. It just sits there, getting more expensive. Because the banks have poured hundreds of billions of dollars into these static assets, that money wasn't spent on upgrading our factories, digitizing our supply chains, or funding scientific research. This is why Australian wages have flatlined for a decade. We aren't getting smarter or faster. We are just bidding up the price of the shelter over our heads and calling it wealth. And here's the kicker. This obsession has turned the banks themselves into a ticking time bomb. In the U.S., if the housing market crashes, it hurts, but the banks are diversified. They own corporate debt, tech stocks, and global assets. In Australia, the banks are all in. Their balance sheets are effectively one giant wager on the price of Sydney and Melbourne real estate never going down. They have cannibalized the business sector to feed the housing beast, and now they are trapped inside it. If the housing market sneezes, the Big Four catch pneumonia. And because they are so massive, making up nearly 30% of the entire Australian stock exchange, if they go down, they take your superannuation, your pension fund, and the entire currency with them. They chose the safety of housing, only to create the most dangerous financial environment in our history. But the government knew this. They knew the banks were creating a bubble. So, to keep the Ponzi scheme going, they needed fresh blood. They needed more people to fill those houses and apply for those loans. So we have a tax system that discourages work and a banking system that starves business. By all traditional economic logic, Australia should have been in a deep, painful recession years ago. So how did the government keep the music playing? How did they avoid the headlines screaming, "economic collapse"? They pulled the oldest, laziest lever in the policy handbook, mass immigration. If you can't make your existing population more productive because you stopped investing in them, there is a cheat code to fake economic growth. You just import more consumers. In 2023 and 2024, the Australian government opened the floodgates. In a single 12-month period, the country added over 518,000 net overseas migrants. To put that number into perspective, that is the equivalent of adding the entire population of Tasmania to the mainland every single year. Why would they do this in the middle of a housing crisis? Because of a dirty little secret called aggregate GDP. Politicians love aggregate GDP. It measures the total size of the economy. If you add 500,000 people, and they all buy a coffee, pay rent, and purchase a SIM card, the total economy gets bigger. The government can stand at the podium and say, "Look, we are growing. There is no recession." But this is a statistical lie. While the country is getting richer, you are getting poorer. This is what economists call a per capita recession. Think of it like a pizza party. If you have one pizza and 4 friends, everyone gets 2 decent slices. If the government invites 4 more friends but doesn't order another pizza, the total party size has doubled. It's a booming party, but your slice just got cut in half. That is the Australian economy right now. For the last several quarters, individual living standards in Australia have collapsed. We are in the longest per capita recession in decades. We are working longer hours, paying higher taxes, and seeing our disposable income vanish, all to prop up a headline GDP number that protects the politicians' reputations. Now, you might say, but wait, immigration is good. We need skilled workers. And in theory, that's true. But here's the friction. You can import people instantly, but you cannot import infrastructure. When you invite 500,000 people to the party, you need to have the beds ready before they arrive. Australia didn't do that. We brought in a record number of people at the exact same moment that our construction industry collapsed. Look at this chart. The blue line is population growth, shooting to the moon. The red line is dwelling approvals, crashing to 10-year lows. This is simple supply and demand physics. We have a vacancy rate of roughly 1%. There are physically not enough roofs for the heads we are importing. This disconnect has turned the rental market into the Hunger Games. We have 50 people queuing for a single damp apartment. We have full-time students living in tents. We have nurses sleeping in cars. So why do it? Why create this humanitarian disaster? Because the housing trap demands it. Are you seeing this in your own suburb? We're hearing reports from every corner of the country. Tell us what the rental market looks like where you live. Remember what we said earlier. The banks and the investors are leveraged to the hilt. They need house prices to keep going up forever. If the population stagnated, demand would drop, house prices would fall, and the banks would implode. The system is now a classic Ponzi scheme. It requires an endless stream of new entrants at the bottom of the pyramid, new migrants and renters, to pay ever-increasing rents, which support the asset prices of the landlords at the top. If the flow of people stops, the bubble bursts, and the victims of this scheme aren't just the locals who can't find a home, it's the immigrants themselves. They are sold the dream of the lucky country, only to arrive and find themselves working as Uber drivers to pay $800 a week for a bunk bed in a crowded share house. The government is effectively using human beings as economic filler to plug the holes in a sinking ship. But as the pressure builds, something has to snap. You can fudge the GDP numbers, but you cannot fudge the social contract. And as Australians watch their standard of living evaporate, the mood on the street is turning ugly. If the economic data is the disease, the social fracture is the symptom that is finally becoming visible to the naked eye. For decades, Australia prided itself on a specific cultural ethos: the fair go. It was a simple, unwritten contract. It didn't matter who your parents were, what school you went to, or where you came from. If you worked hard, followed the rules, and contributed to society, you could buy a home, raise a family, and retire with dignity. It was the land of the middle class, a place without the rigid class structures of the UK or the extreme inequality of the US. But today, the fair go is dead. It has been replaced by a new, ruthless determinant of success: the birth lottery. We are witnessing the bifurcation of Australian society into two distinct species: the asset owners and the assetless. The dividing line isn't your job title, your intelligence, or your work ethic. The dividing line is whether your parents bought a house in Sydney or Melbourne before 2000. This has given rise to a financial institution that is now one of the most powerful in the country: the Bank of Mum and Dad. Recent data suggests that if the Bank of Mum and Dad were a registered lender, it would be the 9th largest bank in Australia. It pumps billions of dollars a year into the property market, funding deposits for children who, despite earning good salaries, cannot save fast enough to catch a runaway market. This creates a feudal caste system. If you are a Nepo buyer, you get a deposit, you get a mortgage, and you get to ride the capital gains elevator to wealth. If you don't have wealthy parents, it doesn't matter if you are a brain surgeon or a top-tier engineer, you are trapped renting forever, paying off someone else's mortgage while your own savings are inflated away. We have effectively returned to Victorian England, where your last name matters more than your resume. But for those at the bottom of this new caste system, the reality is far darker than just renting. Go to a public park in Brisbane or look under the bridges in Melbourne. You will see something that was unimaginable in Australia 10 years ago. Tent cities. And these aren't just filled with the long-term unemployed or those struggling with addiction. These tents are filled with people wearing high-vis construction gear. They are filled with hospitality workers, nurses, and families with children in school uniforms. We now have a massive cohort of the working homeless. These are people with full-time jobs. They have pay slips. They pay taxes. But because the vacancy rate is near zero and rents have risen 40 to 50% in some areas, they simply cannot find a roof. There are stories of families sleeping in cars in the parking lots of the very hospitals where they work. There are grandmothers couch surfing because their pension doesn't cover a studio apartment. This is the visceral reality of the housing trap. It isn't just a line on a graph. It is the physical degradation of the citizenry. The lucky country is now a place where a full-time wage is no longer a guarantee of shelter. The most dangerous consequence of this isn't economic. It's psychological. When you break the social contract, when you tell an entire generation that hard work gets them nowhere, you breed a deep, festering resentment. Young Australians are looking at the boomer generation who bought houses for 3 times their annual income and now sit on multi-million-dollar tax-free assets, and they are furious. They see a government that prioritizes the profits of landlords over the survival of tenants. This erosion of trust is toxic. It kills ambition. Why grind for a corporate career if the tax rate is high and the reward, a home, is out of reach? You might as well quiet quit, spend your money on avocado toast and holidays, and give up on the future. This nihilism is spreading like a virus. It hollows out the workforce and creates a fertile ground for political instability. When people feel they have no stake in the system, they stop protecting the system. They start looking for someone to burn it down. Australia is rapidly losing its identity as an egalitarian paradise. We are becoming a low-trust society defined by envy, gated communities, and a permanent underclass. So, where does this end? Is there a soft landing, or are we heading for a crash that will wipe out everything? If we follow the trend lines to their logical conclusion, Australia is not heading toward a crash. It is heading toward a transformation. We are witnessing the death of the Australian dream and the birth of a new, permanent social order, neo-feudalism. In the 19th century, Victorian England was defined by a simple rule. If you owned land, you were the master. If you didn't, you were the servant. There was no social mobility. You were born into your station. Australia was founded specifically to escape this system. It was the antidote to British classism. But today, we are recreating it with terrifying precision. We are moving toward a future where homeownership is no longer a standard milestone of adulthood, but a luxury good reserved for the top 10% of income earners and the children of the wealthy. In this future, the bottom 90% will live in a state of permanent transience. You will rent until you die. You will never be able to paint a wall, own a pet without permission, or know if you will still have a roof over your head in 12 months' time. You will funnel 40% to 50% of your lifetime earnings directly into the pockets of the landlord class, effectively paying a feudal tax just to exist in your own country. This isn't just an economic shift, it is a reversion to a Latin American style of inequality. We will have gated communities for the asset owners and sprawling high-density rental slums for the workers. The middle class will effectively cease to exist. But there is a catch. This neo-feudal paradise is built on a foundation of dynamite. As we discussed a few minutes ago, the Australian banks have bet the house, literally, on this bubble never bursting. They are all in. If the housing market were to correct, if prices dropped by just 20% or 30%, it wouldn't just hurt homeowners. It would wipe out the equity of the banking sector. Technically, the big four banks would be insolvent. And because these banks are so massive relative to the size of the economy, the government would have no choice but to bail them out. But here's the problem. The Australian government can't print US dollars. It can only print Australian dollars. To bail out a $10 trillion housing market, they would have to print so much money that they would debase the currency. The Australian dollar, AUD, would collapse on the global stage. Since we import everything, cars, fuel, medicine, electronics, the price of daily goods would skyrocket. We would enter a hyperinflationary spiral. This is the housing trap. We can't let prices fall because it destroys the banks, but we can't let prices rise because it destroys society. We are stuck holding a live grenade, terrified to let go. This brings us to the existential question. What is a country? Is it a shared culture, a shared history, a collective effort to build a better future for the next generation? Or is Australia just a highly leveraged real estate market with a flag? Right now, it feels like the latter. We have sacrificed our productive economy, our social cohesion, and the hopes of our youth on the altar of property prices. We have decided that it is better to be a landlord than an innovator. We have chosen stagnation over risk. Germany spent $500 billion on an energy mistake. Australia has spent $10 trillion on a housing mistake. Germany can fix its problem by building nuclear plants. But how do we fix ours? How do you unwind a bubble that is the entire economy? The answer is, you don't. You just wait for it to pop, or you wait for the society underneath it to crumble. This is a bleak picture, but Australia isn't the only resource-rich nation that squandered its potential. If you think this story is frustrating, wait until you see what happened to the country of the future that never actually arrived. Subscribe now if you haven't, because in our next video we are going to look at why Brazil will never be rich. It is the perfect case study of what happens when a country has all the natural resources in the world, but refuses to build the institutions to use them. I'll see you in the next one.